The placard for Apollo 11. This one is historically significant. This is the first lunar landing, July 20th, 1969. And it was a little after 9 o'clock in the evening, Houston time, when Neil Armstrong takes the small step for a man, puts the first footprint on the surface of the moon, followed out a few minutes later by Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot. In the center of the picture is Michael Collins. He remained in the command module in lunar orbit as the other two rode the lunar module to the surface of the moon and back. And now, Armstrong, to me, has always been the most interesting character study of all the astronauts. And we talk a little bit more freely about him. He lost his life a little over 3 years ago, the year 2012, complications following heart surgery, so he is no longer with us. But Armstrong was a remarkable personality, quite different from the stereotype of what most astronauts would be, in that he presented himself as a very humble individual, never seeking attention, and also as someone who had a very keen sense of moral right and wrong. And I'm going to illustrate this in this way. The astronauts come back from the moon. They're instantly the most famous people on the planet, and Armstrong is like the ultimate celebrity. And everybody wants to be with Armstrong. And they say today everybody wants 15 minutes of fame. Armstrong did not. That was not his thing. And he started to bristle at all of the attention that he was getting. And NASA made the situation worse. They kept, forcing him to show up at these big events where everybody would tell Armstrong how great he was. And then they did the worst of all, is they sent him on, he and the other two astronauts, on a goodwill tour around the countries of the world to present moon rocks to kings and prime ministers, heads of state around the world. And every place the astronauts went, of course, they themselves got the royal treatment. And now Armstrong is really feeling uncomfortable. He does his job, but never really feels, that fulfilled by it. Comes back, decides to leave NASA, and he says, I'm just an engineer and a pilot. I'm not going to go around the rest of my life being a famous person. And he determines to become a private citizen, goes to the University of Cincinnati, teaches aerospace engineering, basically stays out of the public eye. And then one other thing was the endorsement offers. Because like any celebrity, Armstrong was presented with multiple opportunities to make a little more money on the side by endorsing certain products. And Armstrong, when this would be presented to him, would have a pretty simple response. He says, when I walked on the moon, I was a NASA employee. NASA paid me a salary. Therefore, I've already been paid for what I did. It will be unethical for me to take any additional money. So that's who we're talking about when we're dealing with the personality of Armstrong. Now, we'll pause here. I'm going to tell you about one story about Armstrong the pilot, because it also illustrates, something of who he was. And the story is that of Gemini 8. Gemini 8 is Armstrong's first flight as an astronaut. It's March 1966. And it is going to be the place where we definitively pass the Russians in the space race. Up to that point, everything that happened in space, the Russians did first, and it was very irritating. But Russians had never figured out the complex mathematics or the complex procedures associated with rendezvousing two spacecraft together in orbit. The Americans had demonstrated that once before, and it is like 50 years ago Tuesday, is the first American rendezvous in space between Gemini 6 and Gemini 7. Rendezvous, station keep, but no docking. And then Gemini 8 with Armstrong and Scott demonstrates the docking. And so they launched this big unmanned device called an Agena upper stage into orbit. They launched the Gemini. The Gemini proceeds through the sequence of maneuvers that allow it to approach rendezvous and dock with the Agena, and it happens perfectly. And it's time for celebration in the control center, which means big cigars are coming out. And then reality sets in, because as they're watching this big configuration, so big Agena, little Gemini, begins to slowly rotate. That's not supposed to happen. And so everything stops to work that problem with the Agena, and nothing works. And finally, Armstrong and Scott are asked to separate and back away from the Agena because of that problem. Well, the problem wasn't with the Agena. The problem was with the Gemini spacecraft itself. It had a stuck throttle. The stuck throttle was causing a rotation. And the rotation, if you're attached to this big Agena, is barely noticeable. But if you're separated from this big mass, this rotation is noticeable because you're tumbling about 1 tumble per second in orbit, and you're about to black out because the rotation rate is accelerating. And it's going to be a bad day because you can't survive that. And Armstrong retains the presence of mind as this is happening to make a critical decision. He engages a second attitude control system, one only to be used during entry. And he uses the jets in that system to counterbalance the force of the stuck throttle. And after about 25 or 30 minutes, stabilizes the vehicle, gains control of it. He saved enough propellant to navigate entry. The astronauts are required by mission rule to look for the first splashdown opportunity. That's in the Northwest Pacific Ocean, about 500 miles to the east of the island of Okinawa. There's no American aircraft carriers out there. They have to fly aircraft out from the American Air Base at Guam to pick them up out of the water about 2 hours after they splash down. So that's your Gemini 8 story. Pretty interesting thing. Absolute historic objectives achieved and almost a horrible failure. Both in the same flight. That's kind of the nature of space flight at that time. We're going to go to the top of the second stage. We can spread out a little bit over there. I can talk a little better to you, and we'll cover a couple of stories, then we'll have 2 stops after that.
So what percentage of fuel is actually burning?
How efficiently do we burn all of the fuel?
Not so much. I can't imagine.
I mean, how much reserve is left?
Yeah, how much reserve?
Typically with the fuel, in the first and second stages, you're going to burn the engines almost to depletion and take whatever energy you've got out of it. Remaining flights, like when we use the engines on the service module, get in and out of lunar orbit, we always program in about a 10%. We're going to save these things. Less than 5 seconds. So it's like silence, boom, boom, rings, boom.
And are all the rockets basically the same? Just
the first stage rockets are about 3 times the thrust of the second and third stage.
It's just a matter of size and the propulsion.
Yeah. So like this one, and this is similar to the rockets on the second stage. It's about 500,000 pounds of thrust, and the first stage is 1.5 million. Okay, we're here by the top of the second stage. Second stage, again, separated a little after 9 minutes into flight. Doesn't quite get you to Earth orbit. Third stage engine ignites for about a minute to complete that trip into Earth orbit. And we'll leave you there in Earth orbit for about 3 hours, checking out systems, getting ready to make the decision to continue on to the moon. Now we passed the placards for Apollo 12 and 13. And I'm going to spend a little more time on Apollo 12 than I am on Apollo 13. Because Apollo 13 is somewhat famous because they made a movie about it with the ingenious title of Apollo 13. But Apollo 12 is not as well known. And Apollo 11, of course, is very historic. And Apollo 13 has all of this, movie made about it. And Apollo 12 is kind of forgotten. But here's what happens in Apollo 12. To me, the most interesting story of all. And a lot of drama, but the drama confined to about a 2-minute period, so I'll attempt to tell this in about 2 minutes. We're going to launch on November 14, 1969, second lunar landing flight as planned. On that day in Florida, there's intermittent rain showers, thunderclouds popping up, dissipating, low cloud ceilings, wind, blustery day. Not really a good day to launch, but we meet all the criteria to launch, and we lift off that morning, and the Saturn V disappears into a cloud deck about 3,000 feet over the pad. 36.5 seconds into flight, the lightning strike. Cloud, the vehicle to ground. It follows the ionized path of the plume back to the pad. Effect of the lightning strike on board is displays in front of the astronauts go blank. Effect of the lightning strike on the ground, the telemetry which comes from the vehicle to the ground that gives the ground controllers all their insight into the condition of the vehicle goes scramble. There, but unreadable. Now what to do? Of course, the ground control team, I mean, part of we are prepared for anything. Not today or not, because this had never been anticipated, never been simulated, no rules, procedures, techniques, or anything to deal with it. On board, what do? You're the 3 astronauts. Your guidance system is moving you perfectly through space. That's not a problem. And for a first stage, it's going to end in about, another 2 minutes from now. And then the second stage is going to ignite. And we've got to make a decision somehow within the first 2 minutes of the flight. And so we've got Plan A and Plan B. Plan A says reset circuit breakers to see if the displays come back. They don't. Now we're down to Plan B. Plan B is the one you don't want to use. Pete Conrad, the commander of that flight, has his hand out in front of him on a T-handle. If that T-handle is turned through 90 degrees, the following sequence is initiated. The command module separates from the rest of the Saturn V. A launch escape tower rocket on its nose fires to propel that out in front of the rest of the Saturn V. The range safety officer is obligated to blow up the Saturn V. We hope we are able to jettison the launch escape tower. We hope the parachutes deploy. We hope we come down in water. We hope that's next to a ship. You don't want to do it. But that's where we are, and we're down to about a minute where we have to make that decision or not. Back to the ground. A guy by the name of John Aaron talks to the flight director. He says, "Flight, look at this telemetry pattern we're looking at here. I remember seeing it once before. We were in a simulation, it was about a year ago, down at the Cape. Everything was normal, and then all of a sudden it went scrambled just like this, and then immediately went back to normal. So it was no big deal. We forgot about it, just went on to the next simulation, didn't affect anything. But later on, he says, I worried about it. How did that happen? Got out the wiring charts, looked through the wiring diagrams, talked to the guys running the simulations that day. Bottom line recommendation, flight, it's a switch. Try SCE to aux. Flight director had no idea what he was talking about. Aaron had to explain what SCE was, a signal conditioning equipment switch. It's got to be set from main power to auxiliary power. SCE to aux. They have nothing else to try. We're down to about 45 seconds. Called up to Conrad, the commander of the flight. Conrad, yeah. SCE to aux. Conrad responds, what in the bleep is that? But Alan Bean, lunar module pilot, heard the call and knew the switch was accessible over his right shoulder, gets his hand on the SCE switch, turns it from main to auxiliary power. Telemetry instantly comes back to the ground. Circuit breakers reset on board. Displays come back. Flight is saved. Now, I rushed you past the placard for Apollo 12 because there's a bunch of bureaucratic gobbledygook on that printout over there. It says, within a few minutes, the flight control team had everything back under control, and we can... No, they didn't. They were clueless, except for one guy that remembered that pattern. At the time, he didn't need to do anything about it. He was diligent enough to find the reason for it, smart enough to find the answer, and he's the guy assigned that day. So there we're talking miracle. We're not talking about how wonderful the flight control team is. But anyway, the flight goes on to be very interesting. We land at a spot on the moon called fittingly Oceanus Procellarum, Latin for Ocean of Storms. 600 feet away from the Surveyor 3, an unmanned spacecraft that landed there in 1967. And among the objectives of the flight, bring back instruments from the Surveyor as well as the lunar samples. So that's your story of Apollo 12. Read about that one if you're interested in pursuing something. Now, Gemini 8 and Apollo 12 are pretty fascinating and not often talked about. Apollo 13, of course, is, so I'll give you the brief version of what happens on Apollo 13. Third lunar landing flight, launched on April 11th, 1970. On the 13th of that month, having launched at 13:13 Greenwich Mean Time on the 11th, on the 13th, Apollo 13 encounters this problem. An oxygen tank explodes. We're 200,000 miles away from Earth, almost all the way to the moon, 56 hours into flight again, and that oxygen tank explodes. That happens in the service module. Service module is just beyond that guy that just took the pictures, the gray cylinder near the very front of the building. The point of the service module is you don't live in there. You live in the command module, which is just beyond it. You barely see the edge of it. But the service module provides everything that supports life for you. It gives you your propulsive capability, gives you your oxygen, your electrical power, your water supplies are all provided from